Every year I try and challenge myself to fish better, do things that I think are going to increase my effectiveness out on the water. And one of the things that I have to work on every year is making sure that I don't spend too long on any one spot for no good apparent reason. And it's really common, happens all the time, even to me. So I think the biggest key to that entire thing is to look at your graph and make sure that you have evidence for being where you're at and why. And usually that's in the form of fish that you see on the graph. Now, then the question arises, well, maybe you catch one. How long do you stay at the spot then? Well, I try and use a rule of every 20 minutes or so. If I'm not seeing good evidence of fish on the graph or I'm not catching fish, I'm trying to move. Sometimes those are small moves, especially if I've seen fish on the graph in the area. I don't make great big moves. When I do make great big moves is when I come into an area, I've scanned it, I've driven around, I've looked for fish, I don't see any on my graph, I have not caught any, especially by that half-hour mark. If that's what's happening, usually I'll make much bigger moves. It might be to deeper water, it might be to different structure, it might be to a different part of the lake even, but the key to figuring out big moves versus small moves is really, again, using your graph. And I think it's really hard for a lot of people, and myself included, to not fish memories. You know where you had caught them, or maybe it was just last week that you caught them. So now let's say you've encountered fish on the screen and you're working them, but you're not catching them, and there seem to be fish in an ample amount, multiple pods of fish, a couple schools of walleyes, and you can't get them to go. In that instance, I start to look at minute small characteristics on the graph. Are these fish belly to bottom, literally barely detectable? They almost look like little rocks with the occasional fish just off bottom. Or are they higher in the water column, maybe a foot off the bottom, and they're kind of spread out and more of a hunting pack? Those are small cues and clues that I'll use to determine, hey, are these fish just simply inactive fish? Or are they active fish and maybe what I'm using isn't the right tactic? Maybe I need to slow up my presentation a little bit or speed it up in the event that they look active. Maybe I need to use a floater on a crawler harness or on my spinner blades to get it up off bottom a little bit so I'm not fishing under the fish. Maybe I need to change some colors and different types of tactics in that regard. So again, if I see active fish on the graph, quite often I'm thinking I'm going to stick to those fish. If they look very inactive, even if I'm seeing good numbers of them, I've tried a couple things they're not catching, then maybe it's time to move to a different portion of the same reef that's maybe getting more wind, an area that fish are likely to be in more activity. Always use the day and your observations to trump all other advice. So if I catch one or two fish in a spot, but I'm not seeing very many on the graph, maybe it's time to move fish. It's the hardest thing to do in the world, to leave fish to find fish. But again, I try to use my electronics to help me figure out how much time I should be spending on a spot, and definitely at that half-hour mark, if nothing's going either from a catching perspective or a looking perspective, I'm gone. So try to use those tips the next time you're out on the water. Don't spend too long on any one spot, especially if you're not seeing those fish on the graph.